Hello, my learned friends, and welcome to HipHughes History, where today we're going to look at the term grand jury. And if you're in an American government course, you really need to know what it is. And if you're in trouble with the feds, you're going to want to know as well. So what are we waiting for? Why don't we go giddy up for the learning and go get her done right now. There's only two nations in the world that use grand juries to this day, and that would be the United States of America and, of course, Liberia. But the tradition dates back to good old England. How about that for an accent? Back to the 12th century, where feudalism is dying out and the king is strengthening his hand with royal courts taking over from feudal courts, and they develop in the local provinces, the local areas, where the sheriff is having these grand juries report crimes to the sheriff, and then the king's men would come and the sheriff would report to the king's men. You get it? And it becomes so hot that it makes its way into the Magna Carta in 1215. It's Article 61 of 63. It's so important, it's the longest one. And it's heavily influenced by Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who really digs this passage from Deuteronomy. If there shall be a controversy between men, and they come unto judgment, that the judges may judge them, that they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. It's been called the shield of the people and the sword of the people. And now we're going to talk about the Fifth Amendment in a second, but the very basic idea of a grand jury is that it is the shield of the people first, that it's going to protect ordinary citizens from unjust prosecution, from the king or the prosecutor, whoever has the power to come and just charge you with a crime. So for instance, if you live across the street from the federal prosecutor and you decide that I'm going to toilet paper his house, he can't wake up in the morning and get mad and charge you with murder. He'd have to go to the grand jury first. So the founding fathers felt that this was so important that they had to throw it into the Fifth Amendment, the Bill of Rights. And let's read you that passage right now. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on presentment or indictment of a grand jury. So what this means, on the federal level, we're not talking about the state level here, that the federal government can't charge you with a felony unless they first go to this grand jury in order to get an indictment. So that is the great shield of the people. But it's also the sword of the people, because it allows the people to accuse and indict their fellow citizens for crimes based on probable cause. Now, I mentioned this before, but this is federal government, not state government. Now, some state governments, they have their own form of republicanism, and certainly some states do have grand juries. But are you ready for this? This is really great vocabulary. You should sit down for this one. The grand jury part of the Fifth Amendment has not been, drumroll please, selectively incorporated by the Supreme Court. That means that the states are not obliged to have that same protection for their citizens when it comes to state law. But if it's a federal offense, if it's a felony, you have to have a grand jury. So now let's take a look at some of the differences between a regular jury and a grand jury, because there's a whole lot of them. So federal grand juries, there is a system. They do have words written down in the federal code. And the first one is that it can be anywhere between 16 and 23 people. So it fluctuates depending on the prosecutor in the district and what they're going for. But you also do not need unanimous consent. You only need 12 of however many in order to indict somebody for a crime. And now the differences really get wide. There is no defense. Okay? There is no defense lawyer. In fact, the prosecutor who runs the whole show, if he has evidence that shows that defendant, the person they're trying to indict, might be innocent, they're under no obligation to show the grand jury. So in a sense, the grand jury really is at the beck and call of the prosecutor. The prosecutor presents evidence, the prosecutor is going to present witnesses, and the prosecutor is really going to put everything that they want in front of that grand jury, and the defendant can't do anything about it. Now, grand jury members can ask any questions they want. They also have the power to subpoena evidence and witnesses. So it is a really heavy power. Grand juries are also held in secret, at least they're supposed to, and this is to protect the innocent from not having their name dragged in the mud, and also to prevent those jury members from not being influenced from outside forces when they decide to indict or not to indict. There's also no exclusionary rule that hasn't been incorporated into grand juries, so if the police find evidence and they've gotten that evidence illegally, it still can be used to indict you. It wouldn't be used at the trial, but it can be used to indict you. And there's also no screening bias for jurors, so they're not allowed to ask questions from the defense to try to get people kicked off that jury. So now why don't we take a look at some examples of grand juries, just in case you want to write about one of them. Now, it's important to note that some of the grand juries we're going to talk about might be grand juries led by prosecutors in districts and federal districts, but you can also have, and this is legal, to have special counsels put together and have grand juries just to be put together to investigate things like organized crime or corruption or political stuff going on. But one of the earliest examples was actually put together under the guise of Thomas Jefferson, who was going after Aaron Burr. He didn't like Aaron Burr very much, and he wanted to charge him with treason. So we actually went through 3 different grand juries, I believe one in West Virginia, one in Louisiana area, and one in Missouri, and he couldn't get the grand jury indictment, but he kept going for it, and finally they got indictment in Virginia, and that case for treason was held by the Supreme Court where Aaron Burr was found not guilty. Now, other big, huge grand jury stuff that you should know is also special prosecutor stuff, and that would be related to Watergate. So in that instance, we had a grand jury that was subpoenaing, is that the word, subpoenaing? We're going with it, who was requesting material under the law from the President of the United States. And that would be the Watergate tapes. And that goes to the Supreme Court because Richard Nixon tried to say executive privilege. I can't show the grand jury. This would endanger national security. And in a unanimous Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court said, no, you got to do it. That the grand jury is, in a sense, a fourth branch of government, and that the same protections for the president that they have with the legislative branch and the judicial branch in terms of executive privilege, they don't have in this investigative body that is seeking out whether a crime occurred or not. And of course, we know that's eventually going to lead to Richard Nixon resigning. And then after the fact, he actually appeared in front of that grand jury. Now, the first sitting president and the only sitting president to sit in front of a grand jury would be Bill Clinton, and this occurred in 1998 when Ken Starr, a special counsel investigating past crimes stemming from something called Whitewater, is going to subpoena President Clinton. And he's going to have to sit and answer those questions under oath. And eventually that's what's going to lead to charges down the road, which impeaches Bill Clinton. And then he goes to the Senate where, of course, he's found not guilty. And of course, we have current grand juries. We had one in 2016 that was investigating Hillary Clinton's emails. And of course, the big one now is Robert Mueller. We recently found out that he has a grand jury that has been put together that is investigating the Russia-Trump collusion story. And they, like other grand juries, have the power to investigate, to subpoena, to call witnesses under oath, and all under the control of Robert Mueller. And then they'll decide whether or not they want to indict for a crime. So that's what a grand jury is. Now, it's important to note that while this is seen as a protection from an aggressive government, that it is, in a sense, liberty, there's also some people that believe that grand juries are a farce, that they are a rubber stamp of the government. In fact, one of the most famous quotes about grand juries comes from a New York judge who once said that a prosecutor could easily indict a ham sandwich. So there is that criticism that the grand jury, these people don't get legal training. They're not given direction on the law. They're under the guise of the prosecuted. They're only being shown evidence that shows the person probably has to do it. It doesn't have to be unanimous, and the bar is lower. It's probable cause. It's not beyond any reasonable doubt. So it is pretty easy to indict somebody with a grand jury. And there's also been criticism that in some instances, the grand jury might be seen as a smokescreen for the public, that if the prosecutor or the government doesn't want to go after somebody, they can easily put a grand jury together, not show a lot of evidence, and then, in a sense, they can wash their hands of that. A lot of that criticism came back in 2014 when 3 African Americans who were killed by the police Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, and Tamir Rice, all had grand juries come back and not indict the police officers, so there was never a trial in the first place. So there you go, folks. That's basically what grand juries are. It is the sword of the people, it is the shield of the people, or it's all a big farce. Why don't you leave down in the comments below, what do you think of grand juries? Are they good or are they bad? Should I stay or should I go? And of course, I'm going to tell you right now that if you haven't subscribed to HipHughes History, you're supposed to do that. It should be like a law or something, especially if you're watching for free. So you can do that on the YouTubes or check us out online at www.hiphughes.com. Go visit the video arsenal. We have over 450 videos for your learning pleasure. And now I'm going to say what I say at the end of every video I've ever done because I believe with all my heart, where attention goes, energy flows. We'll see you friends next time you press my buttons.